Well, hey there, welcome back to Wasting Time in the Woods. When I bought the GX, I thought, what a beast. I'll be able to bring everything I ever need into the woods. 3 days later, I realized the giant oversized roof rack was maxed out, the cab was crammed full of kids crap, and the dog was sharing a seat with my wife.
Hey, ready?
Now, that was all fine with me, but I kept hearing a grinding sound coming from somewhere in the cab. We need more storage. In this video, I'll show you how I yanked out the third row seats in our GX460 to make room for a third row delete platform. I'll break down how I built the all metal mounting system, assembled the deck and integrated L-tracks, and finished it out with some aluminum trim pieces and a couple cans of bed liner, all for about 400 bucks. Then I'll give you a peek at the modular sleeping platform and the drawer system that I'm working on for the next phase of the build. All right, let's go pretend we know how to use one of these things. That's not how it works. That's how it works, there we go. All right guys, our kids are growing up and the third row seats in the GX, well, they're not getting much use these days. They take up about 6 inches of vertical space in the rear, and as much as I love having a built-in stepladder to access the roof rack, it's time to get rid of them. Taking out the third row seats starts with removing the trim and deck board cover. There's a couple of bolts under the tie downs and the rest are just clips. I just popped these little side panels out by hand. Next is the rear trim piece with 3 bolts and a bunch of little clips. A couple more bolts for the deck board bracket reinforcement. Once I had all that out, I was able to access the 4 M10 bolts in the rear. Now I'm retelling the detailed steps here because Past Jake, who wrote this, wasn't feeling too funny. Maybe Past Jake should have had another beer. Oh, look, there's a beer now. Let's see if we can right the wrongs of the past. I tilted the seats up to make it easier to access the 4 M10 bolts in the front, but the manual says you don't have to. The manual says a lot of crap though, and I never read it until I'm making these videos and I'm trying to figure out why my install took so long. Finally, I laid the seats back down, removed some side brackets, and disconnected the wiring harness that supplied the motors. Once all that was done, I pulled the seats out, revealing all that glorious space. And dog hair. There's a shit ton of dog hair down there. Apparently these seat harnesses can supply about 30 amps if you run them in series. Or is it parallel? This is probably a good time to roll the disclaimer. That seemed a little excessive for a channel of this size. Also, some of that was hurtful. Anyway, if you want to tap into these harnesses in Paris series or whatever, check the description below for a fellow GXer who builds a custom harness that lets you tap into the factory power back here without doing any cutting or splicing. I'll cover that in detail when I burn the truck down. I mean, build the electrical system for the rear of the truck. This seemed like the perfect time to get the whole family involved in the planning process.
Like, I'd be cozy doing this.
Well, that's because, like, you're a hardcore outdoorsy.
Right here?
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with that.
I decided to take the rear seat belts out because I have OCD. Most people leave these in because they have important going on in their lives. To get them out, I had to remove 2 4-foot-long trim panels, a stereo amplifier, a giant subwoofer assembly, and half the rear AC unit, which looks like the cross between a Borg ship and a dystopian oil refinery. While I had the rear seat trim panels out, I figured it'd be a great time to soundproof and insulate the truck a bit back here. I used Amazon Basics car soundproofing because it was cheaper and had better fake reviews than the Dynamat. Over the top of that, I added a radiant barrier and attached it with double-sided Gorilla Tape. Now, if you're standing outside the truck, you can't hear me shriek like a baby at the first sight of a serious obstacle. Finally, when it came time to design the platform, I obsessed over all the commercial designs and DIY builds that I could find. I looked at all the awesome designs on the market and the forums, and I said, well, those are just simple designs, fashioned together with commodity hardware. I can build one that good. I didn't even come close, but this is my show, so we're gonna talk about the one I built anyway. I wanted an all-metal mounting system because I want the system to be as strong as possible. In a rollover accident, all sorts of forces come into play. If I send the GX toppling over a cliff someday, I want the canyon to kill me, not the plastic camp toilet that came flying through the cab when the drawer system came apart. For the rear mounts, I used a piece of 1/2-inch aluminum flat bar, 40 inches by 3 inches. For the front mounts, I used 3/16 steel, 1 inch wide by about 4 inches long. I got the aluminum at my local metal shop for about 45 bucks and the steel at Lowe's for about 10 bucks. For the rear, I carefully measured the hole spacing, painstakingly made a digital template which I printed, stitched together, and prototyped on wood. I carefully tested the whole mount system before transferring the center marks to the aluminum bar. I even used a center punch before I drilled. And yet, somehow, I still managed to get one hole an 1/8 inch off the mark and had to warble out a 1/2 inch aluminum bar with a 1/2 inch drill bit for an hour. That doesn't work very well. Don't do that. Since there's a depression in the rear that needs to be filled, much like this show in my ego, I just raised the platform up 1 inch or so to bridge the gap. I didn't think that trying to route out channels or make dados for the wiring harnesses and the key fob connector were really worth the extra inch that you'd gain. I used 1 inch tall 5/8 inch spacers to lift the bar and 1 or 2 beers to lift my spirits. The center 2 bolt holes back here are about 1/8 inch lower than the outside ones, so I just added a couple washers. Someday future Jake will make custom spacers to get rid of the washers, but present Jake's feeling a little lazy at the moment. Holy crap! We're only halfway through this script. Maybe I should have just bought a platform. For the front mounts, I took the 3/16 inch steel to a local machine shop. I was planning on making the front mounts in my garage, but I still had PTSD from warbling out the aluminum. This is Con. He owns KBB Custom CNC in Mesa, Arizona, and he's a saint. He took my prototype, measured it, drew it up in CAD, and transferred it to his CNC machine. He helped me bust out 4 perfect copies for an amount of money so low, I'll not repeat it here. The brackets have a pass-through hole for an M10 bolt where the seats mount into the frame in the front. They rise up over the molded floor pan and then turn at a 40-degree angle to extend out level about 1 centimeter above the raised section of the floor. At the other end, I added threaded M10 125 holes so that all the hardware in the system matched. Check out a link in the description below for the CAD file that Con created for me for that bracket. To tie it all together, I used 4 30mm M10 bolts for the front, and I used 4 75mm M10 bolts for the back. And all the seat holes are threaded M10 1.25 or fine pitch, so I matched that for everything in the system. All right, now that we have a mounting system created, we need a flat thing to put stuff on, like beers, dogs, children, camping crap, I guess, too. I started with a prototype board made out of cheap plywood. We slapped some D-rings on it and took it to Sedona for a weekend. Now that worked pretty well, but I learned a few things. First, the bolt heads would need to be recessed. Second, I wanted better tie downs. And third, it sucks to camp in Sedona now. Seriously, this was our campsite the first night. They changed the rules so there's no more dispersed camping on Lloyd Butte Road, and all the legal spots look like this. For the final platform, I went with 1/2 inch Baltic Birch. That was about 150 bucks for a 4x8 sheet, which is enough to do the whole platform with some left over. Baltic Birch is super high quality plywood that doesn't have any of the little voids that make normal plywood fall apart under stress. It's the sort of stuff they use on boats. Hardware store plywood is, well, I believe the technical term is garbage. I used the same size as the prototype, which is 42¼ wide by 41 inches deep for the final platform. To get the holes transferred for the rear mounts, I took a T-square to mark each side of each bolt, and I drew a line up the platform square to it. Then I just measured for depth and drilled. Now, the really tricky part is getting the front holes marked accurately and convincing your wife that this was still a better idea than just buying a platform. You're on your own there. To mark the front holes, I threaded the bolts in upside down into my brackets with a tiny amount of thread protruding through the mounts. Then I carefully put the platform in, securing it to the rear bolts to ensure exact alignment. Then, using as much precision as I could, I hit it with a big ass hammer. I hit right about where the bolts were protruding from the front brackets, and that transferred the bolt's position into the birch. Then all I had to do was find a center and drill a hole. Solving the tie-down problem and the recessed bolts came in the same idea that I stole from this guy over at t4.org. Now, I love the recessed L-tracks that he did on his 5th gen platform, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do for tie downs as well. Now, I loved how clean it was, but I didn't want to have to use a router to recess the L-tracks like he did. I also wanted to maximize the amount of wood under the bolts for strength. I noticed that the L-tracks are almost exactly a 1/2 inch tall, so I just added another layer of Baltic Birch to the base to make recessing them easy and to double the strength of the platform. I cut the L-tracks using a circular saw. To finish the platform, I located the tracks on the board, and then I cut 2 sections of wood to fill the sections between the L-tracks. Then I covered them in glue, threw a few clamps on, and screwed them more times than Mayor Quimby's girlfriend.
For 3 seconds there, you were legally the mayor.
I just marked and drilled through the mounting holes of the base layer so that I could transfer those holes into the second layer. Now, since the L-track is just about a 1/2 inch, they ended up being perfectly recessed. It's almost like I'm not making this up as I go along for once. I was, but it's like I wasn't, because it actually worked out for once. So the platform ended up thick enough to allow me to recess the bolts fully while still leaving a 1/2 inch of plywood for strength. I used a 1 1/4 inch paddle bit and then threw some bus washers in there for stability, and then some Amazon Fernie plugs to cover our tracks. With the test fit confirmed, I pulled it out to paint. I just used a couple cans of Herculiner. Now, this stuff didn't go on very thick, but it's easy to touch up later, and this stuff has way better texture than the 2-part, which always looks goopy to me. It's held up all summer through a ton of trips, and it's gonna get covered eventually with the drawer system anyways. To attach the L-tracks, I used M6 10mm T-nuts and 16mm M6 bolts. I love these tracks because you can move the tie downs so easily. I added a couple small supports to the front half. The rear is pretty well supported by the aluminum bar. I'll probably put a support underneath the front overhanging eventually. Maybe. I finished it out with 3/4 inch aluminum angle, and I also added foam tape to the floor around the perimeter to keep the dust and the dog hair out and keep anything from rolling underneath it. I could have made little plastic inserts or plywood covers to go in these side wings, but we'll deal with that later when I build the drawer system. Maybe. For now, they make a handy place to store Blazer's gear. I love the way this thing's turned out. It's super functional, it looks great, and it's held up to a full summer of trail abuse with hardly a spot on it. But it took me a ton longer to build than I thought, which is like every other project I've ever done. Now, I could probably do it in a weekend now, but it took a ton of time to just plan everything out and to develop the system. Now, if you guys want to create something similar, I'll throw all of my plans and measurements in the links below, but be sure you double check everything, because I probably didn't. I'll put links to the materials I used below. You can get everything except the metal and the wood on Amazon, and it's all under 500 bucks. Now, that's about half the cost of the closest commercial platform, and to be honest, I think mine's just as good. It's stronger, more versatile, and I'm not worried about drilling extra holes in it when it's time to modify it in the future. For the next phase, I'm building an extruded aluminum frame to support a drawer system and sleeping platform. And if you want to follow along, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you out there.